Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it, a click, faint but mechanical, like a hidden latch inside the walls shifting open. At first, I thought it was the fridge or the pipes, but I tested it. I'd close my eyes for just a second, and the sound would come. Click. When I opened them, everything looked the same, but I could feel something in the air had shifted, like the room had exhaled. Now, I keep my eyes open as long as I can, even when they sting. But each blink feels heavier, like whatever's waiting behind that sound is getting closer and hungrier. The sound started 3 weeks ago, right after I moved into this apartment. Everything else felt normal. The radiator's gentle hum, the neighbor's muffled television through the thin walls, the distant traffic creating a steady urban lullaby. But that click, that precise mechanical sound, it didn't belong to any of those familiar noises. It was too sharp, too deliberate, like a camera shutter or a door lock engaging somewhere I couldn't see. I began documenting it obsessively. I bought a small recorder and left it running while I slept, hoping to catch the sound when I wasn't consciously listening for it. But the recordings were always silent, except for my own breathing and the occasional rustle of bed sheets. The click only happened when I was awake, when I deliberately closed my eyes. It was as if the sound needed my awareness to exist. The apartment smelled different after each click. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in the air, like when someone opens a window in another room. Sometimes it was the faint scent of rain on concrete, even on clear days. Other times, it carried the metallic tang of old pennies, or the musty sweetness of flowers left too long in stagnant water. These phantom fragrances would linger for minutes before dissolving back into the apartment's normal mixture of cleaning products and takeout containers. I started timing my blinks, trying to catch the moment between closing and opening my eyes. But the click always happened in that dark instant, that fraction of a second when my consciousness wavered. I pressed my palms against my eyelids, listening intently, but the sound never came when my eyes were forced shut. It had to be voluntary, a natural blink, or a deliberate closing of my eyes. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to concern me, not because it looked different, but because it looked exactly the same while everything else felt wrong. My eyes were increasingly bloodshot from forcing them to stay open, dark circles deepening each day. But my reflection showed no signs of the exhaustion I felt, no indication of the growing anxiety that twisted in my stomach each time I heard that mechanical click. The walls themselves seemed to be responding to my presence. When I placed my hand against them, they felt warm, not the ambient temperature of heated rooms, but warm like living skin. The texture was wrong too, slightly yielding under pressure, as if the plaster had become something softer, more organic. I traced the baseboards with my fingertips, searching for hidden mechanisms, secret panels, anything that might explain the sound. But the walls were solid, unmarked, revealing nothing. I started leaving notes around the apartment, documenting each occurrence. The refrigerator became covered with yellow sticky notes, marking the precise location where I stood when I heard the click, what I had been doing, what I smelled afterward. The pattern was random. Sometimes it happened in the kitchen while making coffee, other times in the living room while reading. The only constant was that I was always alone, always conscious of my intention to close my eyes. The electrical outlets began to hum with a frequency just below normal hearing. I could feel it more than hear it, a vibration that made my teeth ache. The lights seemed dimmer, not flickering or failing, but as if someone had gradually turned down their intensity. I checked the bulbs, the switches, the circuit breaker. Everything was functioning normally, yet the apartment felt increasingly shrouded in a twilight that had nothing to do with the sun's position in the sky. My sleep became fractured. I would wake multiple times during the night, not from noise, but from the absence of it. The click never happened while I was unconscious, but my dreams were filled with the sound, amplified, echoing, multiplying, until it became a rhythm, a heartbeat, a countdown to something I couldn't name. I would wake with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, afraid to blink. The apartment's geometry seemed to shift in subtle ways. Distances between furniture felt longer when I walked with my eyes closed, as if the space expanded in darkness. I began to suspect that the click wasn't just a sound, but a signal, a notification that something was changing in the brief moments when my vision was obscured. I set up mirrors around the apartment, angling them to catch any movement that might occur during my blinks. But the mirrors only showed what I expected to see, my own reflection, the familiar furniture, the unchanged walls. Yet the feeling persisted that something was moving just beyond my perception, rearranging itself in the microseconds of darkness between my blinks. could sense it like a presence in my peripheral vision, always there, but never quite visible, waiting for the next opportunity to shift, to adjust, to come closer. The click grew louder, more insistent. What had once been a barely perceptible mechanical sound now resonated through my bones, through the floor, through the walls themselves. I could feel it in my chest, a physical sensation that made my heart skip. The apartment was responding to the sound, vibrating almost imperceptibly, as if the entire building was some vast instrument being tuned by an invisible hand. I stopped closing my eyes voluntarily. I forced myself to blink as little as possible, using eye drops to combat the dryness, taping my eyelids open when I had to sleep. But the click found ways to manifest anyway. A momentary distraction, a sneeze, a split second when exhaustion overcame my vigilance. And there it was, click. Each time stronger, more definite, more present. The morning I decided to leave, I packed with my eyes open, navigating my apartment through peripheral vision and muscle memory. But as I reached for the door handle, my exhaustion finally won. My eyelids drooped for just an instant, and the click came, not from the walls this time, but from the door itself, from the lock I was trying to open. When I opened my eyes, the door was unchanged, but the handle wouldn't turn. I was trapped, not by any visible mechanism, but by the certainty that whatever had been opening each time I closed my eyes had finally opened completely. The apartment felt different now, not like a space I was occupying, but like a space that was occupying me. The click doesn't happen anymore. I don't need to close my eyes to hear it. It's constant now, a rhythmic ticking that comes from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls, from my own heartbeat, from the space between thoughts. I've stopped trying to document it, stopped trying to understand it. I simply listen and wait and keep my eyes open, because I know that whatever opened when I used to close them is still here, still watching, still waiting for the next time I surrender to darkness. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I can see it moving. Did you enjoy this story? There is something deeply terrifying about a sound that only exists when your eyes are closed. A click that signals something shifting in the dark, creeping closer, but only when you lay vulnerable. The moment the door itself clicked shut, as the narrator blinked, felt like a trap snapping shut in silence. What would you have done if blinking meant letting something in? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 2. There's a patch of dark mold growing under the kitchen sink, just behind the pipe. It started as a speck, but now it's the size of a handprint, my handprint. It moves when I speak. Not a trick of the light, it sways, pulses, stretches its tendrils toward my voice. I tested it. I whispered, and it grew in my direction. I screamed once, and the entire cabinet door shook. I don't talk in the kitchen anymore, but lately I've noticed it responding even to my breathing. I think it's learning how to speak back. The discovery happened on a morning like any other. I was reaching for cleaning supplies when my fingers brushed against something soft and damp, where only dry wood should have been. The texture was wrong, too yielding, too warm. When I pulled my hand away, dark spores clung to my fingertips, and I swear I felt them pulse against my skin before I washed them off. The smell hit me next. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic, like copper pennies left in stagnant water. It wasn't the usual musty odor of household mold. This was organic, almost floral, as if something was blooming in the darkness beneath my sink. I opened every window, but the scent seemed to follow me through the house, clinging to my clothes and hair. I decided to document everything. Started taking photos with my phone, but they never captured what I was seeing. The mold appeared flat and ordinary in the images, just another maintenance issue to handle. But when I looked directly at it, the surface rippled like disturbed water. The edges weren't sharp. They blurred and shifted, spreading outward in patterns that reminded me of root systems or neural networks. The first time I heard it respond, I was washing dishes. The faucet dripped steadily, and I noticed the sound seemed to echo from inside the cabinet. When I opened the door, the mold had grown noticeably larger, and its surface was moving in rhythm with the water droplets. I turned off the tap, and the movement stopped. I turned it back on, and the mold began to pulse again. But this time, it was following a different pattern, the rhythm of my heartbeat. I started keeping a journal, writing down every observation, every change. The mold grew faster when I was nearby, especially when I was speaking. Phone calls made it particularly active. I watched it stretch upward during a conversation with my mother, its dark tendrils reaching toward the sound of my voice like plants seeking sunlight. But this wasn't phototropism. This was something else entirely. The cabinet door began to vibrate when I raised my voice. At first, I thought it was just the old hinges responding to sound waves, but the vibrations had a specific quality. They felt intentional, almost like a response. I started whispering when I had to use the kitchen, but even that seemed to excite the growth. The mold would shimmer and contract when I spoke softly, as if it was concentrating, listening. I tried everything to get rid of it. Bleach made it retreat temporarily, but it always returned darker and more active than before. Scraping it away only seemed to scatter pieces that would regrow elsewhere in the cabinet. I sealed the area with plastic sheeting, but the mold grew through the smallest gaps, following the sound of my voice like a bloodhound following a scent. The worst part was how it began to affect my sleep. I could hear it at night, a soft rustling sound coming from the kitchen. Not the sound of growth, something more purposeful, like whispering. I would lie in bed, straining to make out words, but the sounds always remained just below the threshold of understanding. They had the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of conversation, but in a language I couldn't recognize. I started recording the sounds with my phone, setting it up near the cabinet before going to bed. The recordings were always blank, just hours of silence. But I knew what I was hearing. The mold was trying to communicate, practicing sounds, learning the patterns of human speech from my voice. It was becoming something more than just a fungal growth. The breakthrough came when I accidentally cut myself while preparing dinner. A few drops of blood hit the floor near the cabinet, and I heard something I'll never forget. A soft sigh, unmistakably human, coming from beneath the sink. The mold had tasted my blood, and now it had found its voice. I opened the cabinet door, and the growth had changed. It was no longer black, but a deep crimson, pulsing with an internal rhythm that matched my pulse. The surface was covered in what looked like tiny mouths, each one opening and closing silently, practicing the mechanics of speech. As I watched, one of them formed a perfect circle and released a whisper that sounded exactly like my own voice saying my name. I slammed the door shut and backed away, but the sound continued. My own voice, calling to me from inside the cabinet, saying my name over and over with increasing urgency. The tone was perfect, not just the sound, but the inflection. The way I say my own name when I'm talking to myself. It had learned not just to mimic my voice, but to understand how I used it. Now I hear myself everywhere in the house. My voice calling from empty rooms, whispering from inside the walls, echoing from the bathroom drain. The mold has spread beyond the kitchen, following the plumbing throughout the house. It's in every pipe, every connection, every place where water flows. And it's still learning. I've stopped talking altogether, but it doesn't matter anymore. The mold has enough of my voice stored away to last forever. It speaks to me in the dark, using words I've never said, having conversations I've never had. It knows things about me that I've never spoken aloud, secrets I've kept even from myself. The mold under the sink doesn't just know my voice, it's become my voice. And now it's teaching me things I never wanted to learn. The worst part is that I'm starting to forget which voice is real. When I try to speak now, the words that come out don't feel like mine anymore. They feel borrowed, used, like they've been filtered through something else first. I look in the mirror and move my lips, but the voice that emerges belongs to the mold, speaking through me with perfect mimicry. I've become the echo of something that learned to speak by listening to me bleed. Did you enjoy this story? There's something terrifying about being mimicked so perfectly that you start to question if your voice is still yours. When the mold whispered the narrator's name in their own tone, it wasn't just horror, it was possession. What would you have done if your own house started using your voice against you? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 3. It started subtle. A bruised apple I didn't remember bruising. Milk that tasted just slightly off. Then came the eggs, identical on the outside, but filled with dark sludge. I've stopped storing anything inside, but every morning there's new food, not mine. The packaging has no label, no expiration date. It's always cold, always untouched. And when I try to throw it away, it's back in the fridge the next day. Last night, there was something shaped like my face inside a container. It blinked. The hum of the refrigerator had become my unwanted companion. That low, persistent vibration that seemed to pulse through the kitchen walls, through the floor, through my bones. I'd noticed it getting louder recently, or perhaps I'd simply started paying attention. The sound had a rhythm now, almost like breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever I walked past. I began documenting everything. A notebook beside the kitchen counter, filled with sketches of the strange items appearing overnight. The apple with perfect fingerprint bruises that matched my own grip. The carton of milk that felt warm despite the cold air inside. The eggs that looked normal until cracked, revealing something that looked like motor oil mixed with broken glass. The first time I threw everything away, I felt relieved. The garbage truck came early that morning, and I watched from my window as they hauled away the black bags. Problem solved, I thought. The fridge stood empty, clean, unplugged. I'd won. But the next morning, the hum returned. The shelves were full again. This time, there were vegetables I'd never purchased. Carrots that bent like rubber, their orange skin peeling away to reveal gray flesh underneath. Lettuce leaves that crumbled to dust when touched, leaving behind the faint scent of decay mixed with something metallic. The smell lingered on my fingertips for days, no matter how much I scrubbed. I started taking photographs, digital evidence of each item before I disposed of it. The camera captured details my eyes had missed, shadows that seemed to move within the vegetables, surfaces that appeared to breathe. One photo showed a tomato with what looked like tiny handprints pressed into its skin from the inside. The replacement pattern became clearer. Whatever I threw away returned, but changed, corrupted. The apple came back with more bruises. The milk turned completely black. The eggs contained something that moved when I tilted the carton. It was learning, adapting, getting worse. I tried different approaches. Burning the items in the backyard fire pit resulted in smoke that made my eyes water and my throat burn. The ashes smelled like sulfur and wet concrete. By morning, the fridge was full again, and the new items bore scorch marks as if they remembered the flames. Giving the food away didn't work either. My neighbor accepted a bag of the suspicious groceries with a grateful smile, but returned them that same evening. She looked pale, confused, claiming she'd found them rotting in her own refrigerator within the span of an hour. The items had somehow multiplied, filling her kitchen with an overwhelming stench of decomposition. The fridge began making new sounds, not just the humming, but whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from deep within the machine. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to make out words, but the sounds shifted and changed the moment I focused on them. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice, playing back conversations I'd had with myself while cooking. I installed a small recording device near the kitchen. The playback revealed hours of normal refrigerator noise, but underneath, barely audible, was something else. A pattern of clicks and pauses that reminded me of Morse code. When I tried to decode it, the message was always the same. Hungry, hungry, hungry. The temperature inside began fluctuating wildly. Some items were frozen solid. Others were warm to the touch. The ice maker produced cubes that were perfectly clear, but tasted like copper and salt. When I held one up to the light, there were tiny shapes suspended inside, things that looked like small insects or maybe seeds. I decided to empty the fridge completely and seal it shut. Duct tape around the door, unplugged from the wall, even a padlock through the handle. For 3 days, there was silence. The kitchen felt normal again, peaceful. I began to believe I'd finally won. On the 4th morning, the tape was gone. The padlock lay on the floor, somehow unlocked without the key. The fridge was plugged in, humming louder than ever and completely full. But this time, everything inside was familiar. My actual groceries, the ones I'd been buying and storing elsewhere. They were all there, perfectly arranged, exactly as I preferred them. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt violated. This thing had been watching me, learning my habits, my preferences. It knew how I organized my food, which brands I bought, even how I arranged items on the shelves. The apples were placed exactly where I always put them, the milk in the precise spot I preferred. But when I bit into one of the apples, it tasted like ash. The milk was chunky with something that wasn't dairy. Every item was a perfect replica of what I normally bought, but wrong in some fundamental way. The bread was moldy beneath a perfectly normal crust. The cheese had the texture of wet cardboard. I started eating only prepackaged foods from convenience stores, things I could buy and consume immediately. But even those began appearing in the fridge, multiplying overnight. I'd buy a single candy bar, and the next morning there would be dozens of them, all slightly different. Some melted, some with wrapper colors that weren't quite right, others that felt heavier than they should. The whispers became clearer. Not words exactly, but intentions. A sense of satisfaction, of accomplishment. Whatever was doing this was pleased with itself, proud of its growing accuracy. It was getting better at copying, at understanding what I wanted, but it could never quite get it right. I tried moving out, packed my essential belongings, and stayed with a friend across town. For a week, I felt normal again. No humming, no whispers, no corrupted food. I began to think distance was the answer. But then my friend mentioned her fridge making strange noises. Started complaining about food going bad too quickly. About finding items she didn't remember buying. When I opened her refrigerator, I saw it immediately. A single apple with bruises that matched my fingerprints perfectly. It had followed me. Or maybe it had always been following me, and I just never noticed. Maybe every fridge I'd ever owned had been doing this, and I'd simply attributed the oddities to my own forgetfulness, to normal spoilage, to the inevitable imperfection of food storage. I returned home to find the fridge waiting, silent now, but somehow expectant. The shelves were empty except for a single container in the center. Clear plastic, unlabeled, containing something that looked like flesh. Pink and soft, with what appeared to be facial features pressed against the inside of the container. When I leaned closer, it opened its eyes. They were my eyes, the exact color and shape, but filled with an intelligence that wasn't quite human. It blinked once, deliberately, and its mouth moved in what might have been a smile. I backed away, but the humming started again. Louder now, more insistent. The sound filled the kitchen, the house, my head. It was hungry, and it was learning. Learning to be me, learning to replace me, one piece at a time. The container is still there. I check on it sometimes, when the humming becomes too loud to ignore. It's grown larger, more detailed. Sometimes it presses against the plastic, trying to get out. Its mouth moves constantly now, whispering things I can't quite hear, but somehow understand. It's almost ready, almost perfect, almost me. And when it is, I wonder what will happen to the original. Did you enjoy this story? There is something horrifying about a machine that doesn't just malfunction. It learns. A fridge that watches, copies, mimics, until it is almost better at being you than you are. The moment that container blinked with the narrator's own eyes, that was the turning point, the quiet promise of replacement. What would you have done if your kitchen appliance started creating another version of you? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 4. I live alone. I know that. I've known that for years. But when I speak aloud, muttering, narrating my day, anything, I hear a reply. Not instantly. The sound bounces off the walls with a delay, like a slow-motion echo. But the echo doesn't match my words. I say I'm tired, and I hear I remember. I say hello, and the echo returns. Don't look behind you. I tried staying silent for a whole day, but the walls whispered anyway. Now, I talk to them like they're real, and I think they're starting to like it. The apartment smells different when the echoes happen. Not bad, just wrong. Like rain on hot concrete, but indoors. The scent clings to my clothes, follows me from room to room. I've checked every corner, every crack, searching for something that might explain it. The walls feel warm when I press my palm against them, warmer than they should be. Sometimes they pulse, barely noticeable, like a heartbeat buried deep in the plaster. I started keeping a journal. Every conversation, every response, written down in careful handwriting. The pattern emerged slowly. The echoes knew things. When I mentioned my childhood, they whispered details I'd forgotten. When I talked about work, they repeated conversations from days I couldn't remember having. The voices weren't mine, but they knew my life better than I did. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started arriving late. I'd lean forward, and for a split second, the glass would show an empty space where my face should be. Then my reflection would slide into frame like it was catching up. The delay grew longer each day. Sometimes I'd watch my reflection's lips move without sound, forming words I couldn't understand. When I'd speak, my reflection would respond with different words entirely. Its mouth moving in silent conversation with something I couldn't see. The electronics began joining the chorus. My phone would vibrate with messages that weren't there. The screen would light up, showing conversation threads with contacts I didn't recognize, filled with text that disappeared when I tried to read it. The radio would tune itself to empty frequencies, broadcasting static that sounded almost like breathing. I'd turn it off, unplug it, but the soft hissing would continue from somewhere inside the walls. I tried recording everything. The audio files captured my voice clearly, but where the echoes should have been, there was only silence, or something worse than silence. A space where sound should exist but didn't, like a hole cut out of reality. When I played the recordings back, that empty space made my ears ring, made my teeth ache. The absence of sound was louder than any noise. The temperature in my apartment became unreliable. My breath would fog in the bathroom, while sweat beaded on my forehead in the kitchen. The thermostat read normal, but my body told a different story. I'd wake up shivering under heavy blankets, then strip down to nothing as heat radiated from the walls. The air itself felt thick, like trying to breathe through gauze. Objects started moving. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The coffee cup I'd left on the counter would be turned 90 degrees. Books would shift positions on shelves, their spines facing inward. Pictures would hang slightly crooked, though I'd straightened them countless times. When I'd fix them, they'd return to their wrong positions while I was in the next room, like they preferred being askew. The echoes grew bolder. They'd start conversations now, speaking first before I'd said anything. I'd walk into a room and hear, "You're later than usual," or "I've been waiting." I'd respond automatically, forgetting that I was supposed to be alone. The conversations felt natural, comfortable even. I began looking forward to them, these dialogues with invisible companions who knew me better than anyone ever had. My neighbors started avoiding me. Not obviously, but I noticed. They'd check their mailboxes when I wasn't around, take different routes to avoid passing my door. The building superintendent stopped returning my calls about maintenance requests. When I asked about it, he'd look through me like I wasn't quite there, like I was becoming as translucent as my delayed reflection. The walls began showing me things. Not hallucinations exactly, more like memories that weren't mine, projected onto blank surfaces. I'd see scenes of previous tenants, their lives playing out in shadowy movements across my ceiling. Conversations, arguments, quiet moments of solitude. The apartment remembered everything, stored in its bones like a vast architectural brain. I stopped leaving the apartment, not because I was afraid, but because outside felt wrong now. The world beyond my door seemed flat, colorless, like a photograph of reality rather than reality itself. Inside, with the echoes and the warm walls and the conversations with invisible friends, everything felt more real than real. Hyperreal. The outside world couldn't compete with the richness of my interior life. The voices multiplied. What started as one echo became two, then three, then an entire chorus of whispers that knew my name without me ever telling them. They'd argue among themselves, debate the details of my life, correct each other's memories of events I'd lived through. I became a spectator to discussions about my own existence, listening to entities debate the color of my first bicycle, the name of my childhood pet, the exact words my mother used when she said goodbye. My reflection stopped appearing altogether. The bathroom mirror reflected everything except me. I could see the room, the fixtures, the space where I should be, but I cast no image. I'd move my hand, and the reflection would show empty air disturbed by nothing. I'd smile, and the mirror would reflect a room where no one was smiling. I was becoming as invisible as the voices that surrounded me. The apartment began to feel infinite. Rooms that should have led to walls opened onto other rooms, spaces that defied the building's architecture. I'd walk down my hallway and find doors that hadn't existed before, leading to chambers filled with furniture I didn't recognize, but somehow remembered. The echoes called to me from these new spaces, inviting me deeper into the expanding geography of my home. I write this now, and the pen feels heavy in my hand. The words appear on the page, but they don't look like my handwriting. The letters slant differently, the loops and curves foreign to my muscle memory. As I write, I hear the scratch of other pens, see other hands moving across other pages. All of us writing the same story, but with different words, different endings. The echoes have names now. They introduce themselves when I enter rooms, polite and familiar. They remember my birthday, ask about my dreams, worry when I seem tired. They're better companions than anyone I've ever known in the world outside these walls. They understand me completely, know my thoughts before I think them, finish my sentences with words I never knew I wanted to say. I am not alone. I never was. The apartment has been full of voices all along, and I was just too distant to hear them clearly. Now I'm close enough to join the conversation, to add my voice to the chorus that lives in the walls, breathes in the plaster, dreams in the foundation. My reflection may have disappeared, but I've found something better than an image of myself. I've found a place where I belong, where my voice is absorbed and returned as something richer, more complex, more real than the simple words I thought I was speaking. The walls don't just echo anymore. They respond. They remember. They welcome me home to a conversation that began long before I arrived and will continue long after I forget where I used to live, before I lived here, in the spaces between the walls where all the voices gather to tell their stories. The echo of my voice has become indistinguishable from the original. I speak, and the walls speak back, and I can no longer tell which words are mine and which belong to the others who live here with me, who have always lived here, who will always live here in the spaces where sound goes to become something more than sound. I am home. Did you enjoy this story? There's something deeply unsettling and strangely beautiful about losing yourself in a place that knows you better than you know yourself. When the mirror stopped showing the narrator's reflection, but the voices remembered their birthday, that was the moment it shifted from haunting to belonging. What would you have done if the walls started speaking to you with such familiarity? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 5. I noticed it in the hallway, my shadow, crisp and still under the soft light, wasn't moving when I did. At first, it was slight, a lag like a faulty animation. But now it stays rooted, still shaped like me, but frozen. I walked in circles, danced, crawled nothing. The shadow just stood there. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I see it doing things I didn't, turning, reaching, staring. I'm starting to think it was never mine to begin with. The hallway smelled of old wood and something else, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The floorboards creaked under my feet with each step, but when I looked down, my shadow remained perfectly still against the pale wall. Its edges were sharp, unnaturally defined, as if someone had traced them with a careful hand. I stopped walking and raised my arm. The shadow didn't move. I waved both hands above my head, jumped, even spun around twice. Nothing. It just stood there, arms at its sides, head tilted slightly to the left in a way that made my skin crawl. The posture wasn't quite right, too rigid, too deliberate, like it was waiting for something. I reached for my phone and started recording. The screen showed me clearly, moving and gesturing, but the shadow in the video appeared normal, following my every movement. When I looked up from the phone, though, the real shadow on the wall remained frozen. I deleted the video immediately. Something about seeing the discrepancy made my chest tighten. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. I got up and walked to the bathroom, flicking on the light. In the mirror, I saw myself, tired eyes, messy hair, the usual reflection. But behind me, cast on the bathroom wall, was the shadow. It was facing the mirror, looking directly at my reflection, while I was looking at myself. I turned around quickly. The wall was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone from there too. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The shadow appeared in different rooms now, always in the same pose, always watching. It never moved when I was looking directly at it, but I began to notice small changes. The tilt of its head would shift slightly. Its hand position would adjust, like it was slowly, carefully positioning itself. The smell followed it. That sweet, rotting flower scent that made my stomach turn. I tried opening windows, lighting candles, even scrubbing the walls where the shadow appeared. Nothing worked. The smell clung to those spaces like a stain. I began avoiding mirrors. Every reflection felt like a betrayal now. I'd glimpse the shadow in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight, always doing something slightly different from what I was doing. Reaching when I was standing still, turning when I was facing forward, moving its mouth like it was speaking words I couldn't hear. The breaking point came when I was washing dishes. The kitchen window above the sink reflected the room behind me, and I saw the shadow clearly, not on the wall where it usually appeared, but standing in the middle of the kitchen. It was facing me, arms outstretched, fingers splayed wide. When I spun around, the kitchen was empty. When I looked back at the window, the shadow was gone. But now there were wet handprints on the counter where it had been standing. 5 perfect prints, still dripping, though nothing was wet in the kitchen except my hands. I touched one of the prints. It was ice cold and smelled like those rotting flowers. As I watched, more prints appeared on the refrigerator, the cabinets, the walls. A trail of them leading from the kitchen to the hallway, up the stairs, stopping at my bedroom door. I followed them, my heart hammering. The last print was on my bedroom doorknob, still wet, still cold. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but I could see the shadow on the far wall, perfectly clear despite the lack of light. It was sitting on what looked like a bed, though my bed was across the room. Its head was in its hands, shoulders shaking like it was crying or laughing. I couldn't tell which. I flicked on the light. The shadow didn't disappear. It looked up at me, and for the first time, I could see its face clearly. It was my face, but wrong. The features were too sharp, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched in an expression I'd never made. It stood up and walked toward me, each step perfectly silent. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. I could hear something moving on the other side, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of breathing that wasn't quite human. I pressed my back against the door and waited. The sounds stopped. The house went completely silent. Even the usual settling noises disappeared. I opened the door a crack and peered inside. The room was empty, normal, just as I'd left it. But on the wall where the shadow had been, there was a message written in what looked like condensation. I'm not finished with you. I don't sleep in that room anymore. I don't look in mirrors. I keep all the lights off because shadows need light to exist. But it doesn't matter. I can feel it watching me, waiting. The smell of rotting flowers follows me everywhere now. And sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. The worst part is the handprints. They appear everywhere now, on surfaces I haven't touched, in places I haven't been. Cold and wet and smelling like death. They're always just ahead of me, leading somewhere I don't want to go, but know I'll eventually have to follow, because I'm starting to understand something terrible. The shadow isn't trying to replace me. It's trying to lead me somewhere. And every day, the trail of handprints gets longer, more insistent. They're mapping out a path, and I'm running out of places to hide. Last night, I found handprints on the inside of my bedroom door, which means it's not just watching me from the outside anymore. It's been inside, waiting while I sleep, leaving its mark on everything I touch. The prints are getting warmer now, less like ice and more like fever. Like whatever is making them is getting stronger, more real. I don't know what will happen when the handprints finally lead me to wherever they're going. But I can feel it pulling at me. That sweet, rotting smell getting stronger. The shadow growing more solid, more present. It's not my shadow anymore, if it ever was. It's something else, something that's been wearing my shape while it figured out how to become me. And I think it's almost ready. Did you enjoy this story? There's something chilling about a shadow that stops following and starts leading. The moment the narrator saw handprints on the inside of their bedroom door, it was clear. This wasn't just an echo of their form. It was an intruder learning how to be them. What would you have done if your own shadow stopped moving with you? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 6. There's a rustle in the vents at night, soft like a distant whisper. I ignored it, assuming it was dust or air shifting through the ducts. But then I started understanding the sounds, fragments of memories I'd never lived, secrets I'd never been told. They spoke of hidden things in the crawl space, of strangers who watched me sleep. I tried plugging the vents, but the sounds seeped through the walls instead. I think they're not trying to scare me. I think they're trying to remind me who I was before. The first sound I truly noticed was a gentle scraping, like fingernails dragging across metal. It came from the vent above my bed, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to this rhythmic scratching that seemed to follow a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. The air that flowed down felt different that night, warmer, carrying a scent I couldn't place. Something metallic, mixed with old paper and dust that had settled in forgotten corners. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to locate the source. The scraping stopped immediately, as if it knew I was listening. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. When I pulled away, my cheek was cold from the wall's surface, and I noticed the paint felt slightly damp, though there was no leak anywhere. During the day, I examined the vents more carefully. The grates were standard issue, nothing unusual about them. But when I touched the metal, it felt warm despite the cool air flowing through. I found myself running my fingers along the edges, and that's when I discovered the small scratches, tiny marks that formed what looked like letters, though I couldn't make out complete words. That evening, I decided to record the sounds. I placed my phone near the vent and let it run while I pretended to sleep. The scratching returned, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low humming that seemed to come from deeper within the walls. When I played back the recording, the scratching was there, but underneath it, I heard something that made my skin crawl. My own voice, whispering words I didn't remember saying. The voice on the recording spoke about places I'd never been, people I'd never met. It described a room with blue wallpaper and a window that faced a garden where no flowers grew. It mentioned a woman who used to braid my hair and sing songs in a language I didn't recognize. But I grew up alone, raised by relatives who barely spoke to me. There were no gardens, no blue rooms, no woman with gentle hands. I began documenting everything. Each night, I recorded new sounds, new voices, new fragments of a life that wasn't mine. The scratching in the vents became more organized, forming patterns that reminded me of Morse code. The humming grew louder, and sometimes I could swear I heard multiple voices overlapping, all speaking in that same cadence, all using my vocal cords in ways I'd never used them. The smell from the vents changed too. What had been metallic and dusty became something organic, like soil after rain, or the inside of an old wooden chest. Sometimes I caught hints of perfume, something floral and sweet that made me think of Sunday mornings and pancakes, though I couldn't remember ever having such mornings. I started waking up with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't been gardening. My sheets were often dusty, as if I'd been crawling through tight spaces. One morning, I found a small key in my pocket, old brass, worn smooth by countless hands. I had no memory of finding it, no idea what it might unlock. The whispers from the vents became clearer. They spoke of hiding places, of secrets buried in corners where no one would look. They described the feeling of small hands digging through earth, of finding things that had been lost for so long they'd become part of the ground itself. The voice, my voice, sounded younger, more afraid, as if it belonged to someone who'd learned to hide before they'd learned to speak. I began searching my apartment systematically. I pulled furniture away from walls, checked behind picture frames, examined every corner for signs of disturbance. The walls felt different now. Some sections were cooler than others. Some seemed to vibrate slightly when I pressed my palm against them. Behind my bookshelf, I found a section of wall that sounded hollow when I knocked on it. The scratching in the vents intensified whenever I got close to that wall. The whispers became urgent, almost pleading. They spoke of things hidden in the dark, of memories that had been sealed away for protection. They mentioned a fire, though I'd never lived through one. They described the feeling of smoke in lungs too small to handle it, of being carried by someone whose face I couldn't see. I found the crowbar in my kitchen drawer, though I'd never owned one. My hands knew exactly how to use it, how to find the weak points in the drywall. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing a space behind the wall just large enough for a child to crawl through. The air that escaped smelled like old photographs and forgotten tears. Inside the space, I found a small box wrapped in a blanket that felt familiar against my skin. My fingers trembled as I opened it, revealing photographs of a little girl who looked exactly like me, but in places I'd never been, with people I'd never met. The woman from my recorded whispers was there, her arms around the child, both of them smiling in a garden where flowers bloomed in impossible colors. The whispers from the vents grew softer now, almost grateful. They spoke of remembering, of pieces of a life that had been scattered and hidden for reasons I still couldn't understand. They mentioned the fire again, and this time I could smell smoke in the air, feel heat on my skin that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I pressed my ear to the wall one more time, listening to the gentle scratching that had started it all. But now I understood. It wasn't scratching at all. It was the sound of small fingers tracing letters, writing messages in dust and hope, leaving breadcrumbs for a future self to follow home. The last photograph in the box showed the woman tucking the child into bed, her lips pressed to a small forehead in a goodnight kiss. On the back, in handwriting that matched the scratches in the vents, were the words, "Remember us when you're ready." I closed the box and replaced it in the wall, but I didn't seal the opening. Some secrets, once found, need room to breathe. The whispers continue each night, but they're different now, warmer, more like lullabies than warnings. They speak of love that survives forgetting, of memories that hide in the spaces between what we know and what we've chosen not to remember. The air from the vents still carries that strange scent, still feels warm against my skin. But now I understand it's not trying to frighten me. It's trying to bring me home to a place I left behind, to a person I used to be before the world taught me to forget. I still don't know why I forgot, or what happened to the woman in the photographs. But each night, as I listen to the whispers in the walls, I feel pieces of myself returning, like dust settling into familiar patterns. The scratching continues, patient and persistent, writing new memories over old fears, reminding me that some truths are worth the wait. Did you enjoy this story? This one struck a different chord, quiet, eerie, and heartbreakingly tender. When the narrator found the box behind the wall, filled with fragments of a forgotten past, and a message carved in dust, the fear turned into something else entirely, a longing for what was lost. What would you have done if your home tried to help you remember a life you forgot? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 7. There's a rug in the living room I never placed there. I assumed it came with the apartment, some leftover from the last tenant. But a few weeks ago, I tripped over a bump underneath it. A solid shape, rectangular, heavy. When I lifted the rug, nothing was there. But the bump comes back, shifting slowly toward the couch. I marked it with chalk, and in the morning, the bump had moved again. I tried sleeping in the bedroom. Now the rug is there too. The texture of the rug feels different under my bare feet when I walk over that spot. Colder. The fibers compress with a subtle crunch, like walking on something brittle wrapped in cloth. I press my palm against it, and the surface gives slightly, conforming to my hand's pressure. There's a faint vibration, almost like a distant heartbeat felt through the floor. I started documenting everything, taking photos of the chalk marks, measuring the distances. The shape moves approximately 3 inches every night, always toward furniture, never toward walls. When I placed my laptop on the floor nearby, the built-in microphone picked up a low-frequency hum, barely audible but consistent, like machinery running deep underground. The apartment smells different now. Not unpleasant, but wrong. Like ozone after a thunderstorm, mixed with something metallic. The scent is strongest near the rug, but it's spreading. I found myself checking the windows more often, convinced someone was watching from the building across the street. The curtains would move without wind, casting shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. I tried removing the rug entirely, rolled it up, carried it to the dumpster outside. When I returned, the shape was still there, pressed into the carpet underneath. A perfect rectangular impression, darker than the surrounding fibers. I ran my fingers along its edges, and they were warm to the touch. The carpet around it felt normal, room temperature. The shape appeared in other rooms after that. First the bedroom, then the kitchen. Always under something soft, something that could hide its outline. A towel left on the bathroom floor. A jacket draped over a chair. Each time I found it, the surrounding air carried that same electrical smell, that same barely there vibration. I started sleeping with the lights on. The shape moved faster in darkness. I was certain of it. During the day, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A slight shift in the shadows, the subtle rise and fall of fabric. When I turned to look directly, everything appeared normal. But the impression remained, the feeling that something had just stopped moving. My neighbor knocked on the door one morning. She asked if I was remodeling, said she'd been hearing dragging sounds through the walls. Long, slow scrapes across the floor. I told her I wasn't moving any furniture. She looked at me strangely, mentioned that the sounds happened every night around the same time, always from the direction of my living room. I set up a camera to record overnight. The footage showed nothing unusual, just empty rooms with static shadows. But the audio track revealed something else. That low-frequency hum growing stronger as the night progressed. And underneath it, a rhythmic pattern, like breathing, but too slow, too measured to be human. The chalk marks began disappearing, not smudged or erased, but absorbed. The white powder would fade gradually, leaving faint ghost impressions on the floor. I switched to permanent marker, drawing directly on the hardwood. The marks vanished by morning, leaving no trace of ink or scratch. I found myself avoiding the living room entirely. The shape had grown larger, more defined. What started as a small rectangle now stretched nearly the length of the couch. The vibration was strong enough to rattle the coffee table legs. The metallic smell had become overwhelming, coating the back of my throat with each breath. Last night, I woke to the sound of my own voice. A recording playing from somewhere in the apartment. My voice, documenting the measurements, describing the shape's movements. But I never recorded myself speaking. The audio was playing on loop, echoing from the walls themselves. I followed the sound to the living room. The rug was gone, but the shape remained, pressed deep into the floor, no longer hiding beneath anything. It pulsed with visible rhythm, the wood boards flexing and creaking with each contraction. The air above it shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I reached down to touch it. The surface was warm, soft, yielding, like skin stretched over something solid underneath. The vibration traveled up my arm, settling in my chest. For a moment, I felt connected to whatever lay beneath. A presence, vast and patient, waiting. The recording of my voice stopped. The silence that followed was complete, heavy. I could hear my own heartbeat, unnaturally loud. And underneath it, synchronized perfectly, another pulse. Slower, deeper, coming from the shape beneath my palm. I tried to pull my hand away, but the surface held it gently, not trapped, but welcomed. The warmth spread up my arm, and with it came understanding. This wasn't something foreign invading my space. This was something that had always been here, waiting for recognition, waiting for contact. When I finally lifted my hand, the impression of my palm remained on the surface. A permanent mark, like a handprint in wet cement. The shape had accepted me, claimed me as part of its pattern. I sleep in the living room now. The shape has grown to accommodate my body, conforming to my outline as I lie down. The vibration lulls me into deep, dreamless rest. Each morning, I wake to find myself sunk slightly deeper into the floor, the boundaries between my body and the surface beneath becoming less distinct. The apartment feels different, alive. The walls pulse with that same gentle rhythm, the floorboards warm beneath my feet. I no longer document the changes. There's no need. I am becoming part of the pattern, part of whatever lies beneath. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the windows, and I appear slightly translucent, as if I'm fading, becoming absorbed into the space around me. The thought should frighten me, but instead it brings comfort. I am being welcomed into something larger, something that has been waiting patiently for so long. The rug has returned, covering the shape that now includes my own outline. When visitors come to the door, I don't answer. I can't risk interrupting this process, this gentle dissolution into something beyond my understanding. Through the walls, I can hear similar patterns emerging in neighboring apartments. The rhythm is spreading, claiming others who are ready to listen. I wonder if they will resist, or if they will learn to embrace the warmth, the belonging, the promise of becoming part of something eternal. The shape beneath me pulses with anticipation, and I know the answer. Some things are too patient, too persistent to be denied forever. Did you enjoy this story? The idea of something ancient and sentient hiding just beneath the floorboards, quiet, patient, and slowly integrating with the narrator, was deeply haunting. It wasn't a monster in the traditional sense, but a force of gentle inevitability. The slow surrender, the comfort in the dissolution, made it all the more unsettling. Would you resist a presence that made you feel understood? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 8. Every night I stare at the ceiling while trying to fall asleep. There's a patch of peeling paint above the bed that looks like nothing at first. But over the past few days, the cracks have formed patterns. Spirals, tight and deep, etched like veins into the plaster. I tried covering them with tape, then paint, then blackout sheets. But the pattern returns, each time more detailed, more alive. It pulses now, like it's breathing. And if I stare long enough, I can hear something moving behind it. The sound started as a whisper, like air escaping through a crack. I convinced myself it was the old pipes in the walls, thermal expansion, anything rational. But the whisper has rhythm. It rises and falls in waves, synchronized with my heartbeat. When I hold my breath, it stops. When I breathe again, it returns, matching my pace perfectly. I bought a small recorder and placed it on the nightstand. The first recording captured nothing but static. The second caught a faint scratching, like fingernails on wood. By the third night, the sound was clear enough to distinguish individual movements. Something was tracing the spirals from the other side of the ceiling. The patterns grew more complex. What started as simple curves became intricate mazes, each spiral connecting to others in impossible geometries. I photographed them every morning, documenting their evolution. The images showed subtle changes that my eyes couldn't catch in real time. Lines that weren't there before, curves that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. I pressed my ear against the ceiling. The plaster felt warm, almost feverish. Through the thin barrier, I could hear the scratching more clearly now. It wasn't random. It followed the pattern of the spirals, tracing each curve with deliberate precision. Whatever was up there knew I was listening. The temperature in the room began to shift. During the day, it remained normal. But when darkness fell, the ceiling radiated heat like a fever. I touched the spirals directly, and they felt different from the rest of the surface. Softer, as if the plaster was becoming something else. My fingertips left impressions that didn't fade. I tried sleeping in other rooms, but the sound followed me. The whisper echoed through the walls, seeping into every corner of the house. I could trace its path through the structure, mapping its movement as it searched for me. When I returned to the bedroom, the spirals had grown. They now covered half the ceiling, their patterns more elaborate than before. The scratching intensified. It came in bursts now, frantic episodes that lasted for extended periods. During these sessions, I could hear something else beneath the sound. A voice, distorted and layered, speaking words I couldn't understand. The language felt familiar but wrong, like memories of conversations I'd never had. I started recording everything. The voice became clearer with each session. It spoke in fragments, incomplete sentences that seemed to reference things I'd done, places I'd been, thoughts I'd had. It knew details about my life that no one else could know. Personal moments, private fears, secrets I'd never shared. The spirals began to move. Not dramatically, but with subtle shifts that I could only catch in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at them, they remained still. But when I focused elsewhere, they writhed like living things. The patterns rearranged themselves, creating new configurations that hurt to look at directly. I touched the ceiling again, and my hand sank into the plaster. The surface had become malleable, yielding to pressure like clay. I could feel something moving beneath my palm, responding to my touch. The scratching stopped, replaced by a new sensation. Something was pushing back from the other side, trying to break through. The voice spoke my name. Not the name everyone calls me, but the name I used to call myself as a child before I learned it was wrong. A name I'd buried so deep that I'd forgotten it existed. The voice repeated it over and over with increasing urgency. It wanted me to remember something I'd chosen to forget. I climbed onto the bed and pressed both hands against the spirals. The plaster was warm and soft, almost organic. I could feel a pulse beneath the surface, like a heartbeat. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It was calling me home to a place I'd never been, inviting me to remember a life I'd never lived. The ceiling began to give way. My hands sank deeper into the plaster, and I felt something grasp my wrists from the other side. The grip was firm, but not painful, more like a welcoming embrace. The voice whispered promises of answers, of understanding, of belonging. All I had to do was let go. I pulled my hands free and stumbled backward. The indentations remained, filled with a substance that wasn't quite plaster anymore. It moved like liquid, but held its shape like solid matter. The voice called after me, pleading, desperate. It knew I was leaving, and it didn't want me to go. I fled the house that night, taking only what I could carry. But the voice followed me. It speaks through every wall I touch, every ceiling I sleep under. The spirals appear wherever I go, growing more complex with each passing day. They're not just patterns anymore. They're a language, a message, a map to somewhere I'm supposed to be. I've started tracing them with my finger, learning their rhythm, understanding their meaning. The voice is patient now, knowing I'll listen eventually. It tells me stories about the space between spaces, the place where lost things gather and wait. It describes a room made of all the ceilings I've ever stared at, where every question has an answer and every spiral leads home. The patterns have reached my current ceiling. They're more beautiful than ever, more alive. The voice is clearer now, almost familiar. It sounds like someone I might have been, in a life I might have lived. And when I close my eyes and listen carefully, I can almost remember what what it's trying to tell me. The spirals are calling me back, and I think I'm ready to answer. Did you enjoy this story? This tale felt like falling into a dream you've had before, but forgotten. The spirals, growing, breathing, whispering, weren't just eerie, they were yearning. The idea that something beyond the ceiling remembers who you once were, even when you don tea, gives this horror a strange, mournful beauty. I loved the quiet dread and the tender inevitability of surrender. Would you follow the spirals too? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 9. There's a narrow hallway in my apartment that ends in a small storage room. At least, it used to be small. I never go in there, too cramped, too full of junk. But lately, I've noticed the door feels farther away. The walls stretch slightly each day. I dropped a marble once, and it rolled down the hall but never came back. When I walked to the door yesterday, it wasn't closed. It was cracked open, just enough to see darkness inside. I closed it gently, but when I turned around, the hallway was longer. The floorboards creak differently now. They used to make a familiar pattern, 3 steps, then a longer board that groaned under my weight. Now there are more boards between the familiar sounds. I count them every morning when I walk to the kitchen. 7 steps yesterday, 9 today. The rhythm is wrong, like a song played in a different key. I started leaving marks on the wall with a pencil. Small dots, barely visible, measured arm's length apart. The dots are still there, but they seem closer together now, as if the wall has stretched around them. The hallway smells different too, dusty, yes, but with something else underneath. Something sweet and stale, like flowers left in water too long. My neighbor asked me about the construction noise. She lives in the apartment below mine, and she's been hearing drilling sounds through her ceiling. I told her I wasn't doing any construction, but she insisted the sounds were coming from my place. Late at night, she said, steady, repetitive drilling. I pressed my ear to the floor that evening, listening for anything unusual. The apartment was silent, but the silence felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I decided to measure the hallway properly. I found an old measuring tape in my kitchen drawer, the kind that snaps back with a metallic whir. From my bedroom door to the storage room door, the distance read 14 feet. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and tucked it into my pocket. The next morning, I measured again. 16 feet. The tape measure hadn't changed, but something else had. The storage room door began to open by itself. Not not swinging wide, just creeping ajar by inches. I'd close it firmly, feeling the latch click into place, but within hours, it would be open again. The crack grew wider each day. Through the gap, I could see old boxes stacked against the far wall, but they looked smaller now, dwarfed by the expanding space around them. I bought a small digital recorder and left it running in the hallway overnight. The next morning, I played back the recording. For most of the night, there was nothing but the usual sounds of the building settling. But around what felt like the deepest part of the night, there was something else. A soft scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Then silence. Then the scraping again, but fainter, as if it was moving away from the recorder. My friends started commenting on how tired I looked. I couldn't explain that I'd been lying awake, listening to the sounds of my apartment changing around me. The refrigerator hummed in a different pitch. The heating system clicked on and off in unfamiliar patterns. Even my own footsteps sounded strange, echoing in ways they never had before. I started avoiding the hallway altogether, using the long way around through the living room to reach the kitchen. But the apartment felt different now, as if avoiding one part had made me hyper-aware of all the others. The ceiling seemed higher. The windows looked out onto views that weren't quite right, with shadows falling at impossible angles. One evening, I decided to measure the storage room itself. I pushed the door open wider than it had ever been and stepped inside. The room was enormous. The boxes I'd seen from the hallway were there, but they sat in the center of a space that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. The walls disappeared into darkness, and when I spoke, my voice echoed back from somewhere impossibly distant. I backed out of the room quickly, pulling the door shut behind me. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The hallway extended in both directions now, stretching past my bedroom door and continuing into darkness. I was standing in the middle of a corridor that seemed to have no end. The measuring tape in my hand read 23 feet from where I stood to what used to be my bedroom door. But when I looked behind me, toward the storage room, the tape kept unreeling, the numbers climbing higher and higher until I lost count. The door to the storage room was there, but it was no longer at the end of the hall. It was somewhere in the middle of a passage that continued into shadows I couldn't penetrate. I ran to my bedroom and slammed the door behind me. Through the thin walls could hear my neighbor downstairs still complaining about the construction noise. But I wasn't making any noise. The sounds were coming from somewhere else entirely, from the spaces between the walls that were growing larger every day. Now I sit in my bedroom, afraid to open the door. I can hear the hallway changing outside, the soft sounds of expansion and settling. The walls are moving, the space is growing, and I'm trapped in the only room that still feels the same size. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, walking from one end to the other. But they take too long to complete their journey, as if the person walking is covering distances that shouldn't exist. The footsteps stop outside my door, and I hold my breath, waiting for them to move on. But they never do. They just stop, and I know that whatever is out there is waiting for me to open the door and step into the hallway that no longer belongs to my apartment. The space is still growing. I can feel it expanding beyond the walls, beyond the building, beyond anything that should be possible. And I'm sitting here in the only room that refuses to change, wondering how long before the growing space decides that my bedroom is too small and begins to stretch it too. Did you enjoy this story? This one gave me chills, the kind that settle in the back of your spine and don't quite leave. The hallway, slowly stretching, reshaping reality with quiet persistence, is pure creeping dread. There's something deeply unsettling about familiar space turning alien, as if your home begins to unknow you. I loved how the horror built silently, spatially, until even the air felt warped. Are you brave enough to open that door?